over to Jana, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Bettina. It is my honor today to welcome you all on behalf of the Library Committee of the German Society. Before we'll introduce Dr. Leroy Hopkins in a second, let me say a few words about the Library Committee and why we are so excited to host this event series. As a Library Committee, we see it as our duty to not only talk about preserving our fragile historic collections and respective renovation work, for instance, but also to find ways of how we can start new conversations about the items and thereby connecting history to the present. Just recently, committee members such as Dorothee Schneider and Frank Trommler have actively engaged with our collections and the audience by offering library treasure tours in the original 1880 reading room. There will be 2 more this year, and we will post all information about dates and registration in the chat. But tonight we want to use the virtual environment to dive into our collections and talk about their transatlantic dimensions, their past, their present, and their future. How did Black intellectuals interact with German culture institutions? What attracted these highly talented individuals to Germany, and what was the German response? These questions will guide tonight's lecture by Dr. Leroy Hopkins, titled Black Prussians, African-American Intellectuals in German Culture. This event is the first installment in a 2-part Gunther Finke Memorial Lecture. Dr. Leroy Hopkins, a native of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, from where he's also joining us tonight, received a BA in German and Russian from Millersville State College in 1966 and a Ph.D. in Germanic Languages and Literatures from Harvard University in 1974. Dr. Hopkins served as Associate Director of Program and Planning and then as Acting Executive Director of the Urban League of Lancaster County. He began his tenure at Millersville State College, later Millersville University, retiring in 2015 as Professor Emeritus of Foreign Languages. In 1969 to 70, Dr. Hopkins was a Dankstipendiat of DAAD at the Philipps Universität Marburg an der Lahn. In 1989 and again in 1995, he received a travel grant from DAAD for his research first on people of color in Germany from 1500 to the present, and for Africans and African Americans in Hamburg. In 1993, Dr. Hopkins had been given a free trip to Germany by the AATG for his article in Unterrichtspraxis on Africans in Germany. His publications on Africans and Germans appeared in the GDR and also in Senegal. Dr. Hopkins was most recently featured in Transatlantic German Studies, Testimonies to the Profession. And it was my library committee member, Professor Dr. Frank Trommler, who engaged Dr. Hopkins to edit and contribute to the volume, Who is a German? Historical and Modern Perspectives on Africans in Germany, published by the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies of the Johns Hopkins University in 1999. And now let me welcome Dr. Hopkins. Thank you for being here, and the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for the invitation, and I'd also like to thank Frank Trommler for contacting me several months ago. We met at Harvard. Anyone interested in the impact of German culture in America has a handy guide, Henry A. Pochmann's German Culture in America, published in 1961. A perusal of its over 800 pages will not, however, yield any information on our topic, African Americans in Germany. In the 19th century, some African Americans displayed an intellectual affinity to German language and culture. Former fugitive slave James W.C. Pennington sought and received an honorary doctorate in theology from the University of Heidelberg in 1849. Frederick Douglass, also a self-liberated enslaved African, had a second autobiography published as Sklaverei und Freiheit, Autobiography by Hoffmann and Kampe in Hamburg in 1860. From 1892 to 1894, W.E.B. DuBois studied at the University of Berlin. He had to give up his quest for the earned doctorate because of a lack of funds prevented him from satisfying the residency requirement. What was the source and purpose of this Germanophilia? When Pennington acquired his degree in 1849, there were no African Americans, only enslaved and free Africans with little difference between either status. For over 2 decades, free Africans faced the threat of coerced repatriation to Africa, mob violence, and increasingly restrictive laws designed to eliminate them as economic competitors. In 1850, the US Congress asserted the status of enslaved Africans as property through the Fugitive Slave Act, which coerced even innocent bystanders to actively assist in the recapture of freedom seekers and incentivized the abduction and sale into slavery of free Africans. Finally, in the Dred Scott decision of 1857, the US Supreme Court declared that Africans had no rights which a white man need consider, and it was never the intent of the founding fathers to make Africans citizens. Against this background, an interest in German culture seems counterintuitive until one considers the evolving intellectual community among free Africans after the revolution. During this period, in places as disparate as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, Masonic lodges and independent Black churches were formed. Education as a key to emancipation and citizenship was the goal of individuals such as Prince Hall, Absalom Jones, and Richard Allen. One vehicle for promoting literacy and community development was the newspaper. The first Black newspaper to appear was Freedom's Journal, published in New York City from 1827 to 1829. Its editors were John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish. Cornish was a Presbyterian minister, and Russwurm was a graduate of the Hebron Academy and Bodine College, where he may have been exposed to the teaching of German in the 1820s. During the newspaper's short run, there are a number of references to Blumenbach, Henri Grégoire, and Lessing. Notably, in April 1828, Freedom's Journal presented an unattributed translation of an excerpt from the first chapter of Jean Paul's Fliegeljahre, titled The Last Will and Testament, The House of Weeping. This was undoubtedly a reprint of Thomas de Quincey's earlier translation. While the appearance of a Jean Paul text shows evidence of an awareness of contemporary literary taste, the various references to Grégoire and Blumenbach are much more germane to the attraction which free Africans felt to German culture. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was an early pioneer in the fields of anthropology and biology. During his tenure at the University of Göttingen, he published important works on the origin of the races. One of his notable publications was the 1789 essay, Eine Reise in die Schweiz, to which he appended a list of notable Africans living outside of Africa. In reviewing what he had learned about Africans, Blumenbach noted that Africans were not only the equal of Europeans, but some excelled them. When the essay was published by the American Philosophical Society in 1799, the comparison of Africans and Europeans was omitted. Blumenbach's essay and his research on Africans placed him in the emerging transatlantic abolition movement and also in the vanguard of the emerging field of scientific racism. When the British troops left America in 1783, approximately 10,000 former enslaved Africans left with them and were settled in Nova Scotia. About 200 of that group returned with the so-called Hessian mercenaries and were settled in the garrison in Kassel. Samuel Thomas von Semmering, who later acquired renown as an anatomist and inventor, shared the corpses of these expatriated Africans with Blumenbach for experiments used by both men to further their research on race. Blumenbach's findings were more germane to the interests of free Africans because among those whom he identified in his 1789 essay was Anton Wilhelm Amo, who lived from 1703 to about 1759. Brought as a child to Europe in 1707 by the Dutch West India Company, Amo was a gift to the Dukes August Wilhelm and Ludwig Rudolf von Wolfenbüttel. Perhaps the subject of European experiments to determine if Africans were human, he was educated at the Wolfenbüttel Ritter Academy and the University of Helmstedt. He subsequently attended the University of Halle, where he submitted a thesis to the law school titled Dissertatio Inauguralis de Jure Majorum in Europa. That was in 1729. In his thesis, he argued for equal treatment of Africans in Europe because they too had a legal tradition as old as the European. For his further studies, Amo enrolled at the University of Wittenberg, where he studied logic, metaphysics, physiology, astronomy, history, law, theology, politics, and medicine. Quite a schedule. He had reportedly mastered 6 languages: English, French, Dutch, Latin, Greek, and German. He received his doctorate in philosophy from Wittenberg in 1734. Returning to the University of Halle, he was named a professor of philosophy. Amo used his preferred name, Antonius Guillermus Amo Afar. Afar means from Africa. The death of his protector and a public campaign to defame him caused Amo to return to Africa. Little is known of his later years, but in 1808, Abbé Grégoire mentioned him in his work, The Literature of the Negro, and the November 24th, 1828 edition of Freedom's Journal mentions Grégoire's entries on Hannibal and Amo. On January 24th, 1829, one also finds in the journal a reference to Blumenbach's library of works written by Blacks. However, the most important reference to Amo we find in a booklet published in 1841 by James W.C. Pennington, titled A Textbook of the Origin and History, etc., of the Colored People. There on page 49, we find listed 1744, Amo, and a brief paragraph outlining Amo's career and a statement that he had published several important treatises in 1744. The description closes with a note that Amo was born in Guinea. Here, Pennington uses one of the generic terms for Africa. Ethiopia is another one. The importance of Amo to Pennington is quite clear. Throughout his life, Pennington had criticized slavery because it had robbed him of a chance to become truly educated. If he had not stolen himself, he would have remained an illiterate chattel. Amo had fulfilled the dream which Pennington was striving for himself, and he had done it in a German setting. How did Pennington learn about Amo? It was not through Freedom's Journal. When it was published, Pennington was still acquiring basic literary skills. Neither Grégoire nor Blumenbach is explicitly mentioned in a second antebellum Black newspaper, Colored American, which appeared in New York City from 1837 to 1842. However, one of its editors, Samuel Cornish, who had published the earlier newspaper, may have been a source. The abundance of references in the newspaper to Goethe, Schiller, Wieland, and Klopstock, plus the fact that Pennington himself was the author of a number of articles in the newspaper on education for Black children, suggests that Amo was known by the free African readership. To understand Pennington's path to the honorary doctorate from Heidelberg, it is important to understand the role played by Friedrich Wilhelm Karove. He was a founder of the Heidelberg Burschenschaft. He participated in the Wartburg Fest. He served in the Provisional Parliament in Frankfurt, and held a doctorate in philosophy from Heidelberg. In 1849, Caravay served as vice president of the Second General Peace Conference, which met in Paris. He met Pennington at the conference and was impressed by the latter's campaign for freedom and social justice. Perhaps he was also aware of Pennington's autobiography, which appeared that year in London as The Fugitive Blacksmith. Being a member of the theological faculty at Heidelberg, Caravay was in a position to recommend that Pennington be granted an honorary degree as a symbol of what Pennington himself had requested, a sign of support for his anti-slavery campaign. That legacy is continued today. Since 2011, the University of Heidelberg annually gives a James W.C. Pennington Award to a scholar who has done outstanding work on a topic important to Pennington. This year, from August 20th to 21st, Pennington was the theme of the international conference held virtually and live at the university, hosted by the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. Perceived German receptivity to anti-slavery work motivated Frederick Douglass to have his second autobiography translated. The appearance of the first edition in 1845 motivated recent immigrant Ottilia Assing to contact Douglass. Ottilia Assing was a niece of Varnhagen von Ense, and she had emigrated to the United States in 1852 and settled first in New York and then in Hoboken. Marie Diedrich has described most vividly Ottilia's relationship to Douglass, and especially how that relationship evolved after 1856, when Ottilia moved to Rochester. She offered herself as a translator of his autobiography. Over 30 years ago, Terry Pickett, then of the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, was surprised to find a letter from Douglass among the correspondence of Varnhagen von Ense on deposit in the former Breslau, or Wroclaw today. Varnhagen von Ense was literarily well connected. His wife, Rahel, had conducted a very popular salon in Berlin, which attracted the literati and thinkers of the period. Clearly, it was hoped that Varnhagen would help locate a publisher for Douglass. Douglass himself sought the notoriety of a German publication. In his 1850 article, Adopted Citizens and Slavery, which appeared in his newspaper, Douglass's Monthly, Douglass lamented the fact that many German Americans voted for the Democratic Party and had helped elect James Buchanan. They were nonetheless explicitly opposed to slavery. Douglass carefully differentiated between the newly arrived German 48ers and the long-established conservative German groups who seemed indifferent to the plight of Blacks, and these are Germans from my area. By publishing his autobiography in Hamburg's Hoffmann and Kampe Verlag, Douglass hoped to attract the attention and support of those liberal Germans who most recently had fought to establish civil rights in their country. Unfortunately, Douglass's autobiography was overshadowed by Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and only appeared in one edition. It was not until the 1960s that Douglass would again appear in German, and characteristically in the German Democratic Republic, where interest in American flaws were ever present. Before W.E.B. Du Bois left to study at the Berlin University in 1892, some important changes had occurred in the education of Black Americans. In Philadelphia in 1837, thanks to Quaker philanthropy, an Institute for Colored Youth was established. That institution survives, if only precariously today, as Cheney University of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. From its inception, the Institute was immersed in the controversy of what should be taught to Blacks recently freed from slavery or who were free-born. Charlene Conyers, author of A Living Legend, The History of Cheney University for the period 1837 to 1951, mentions the intention of Fanny Jackson Coppin, principal of the Institute from 1867 to 1902, to introduce a kindergarten and German language instruction. Both initiatives were canceled by the Board of Managers, yet in 1867, recent graduate Frazelia Campbell was hired to teach Latin, German, and French, and in Spanish. According to Coppen's memoir published in 1913, Campbell taught those subjects until the institute was moved to Delaware County and renamed Cheney Institute. Most academic programs were dropped and replaced with increased emphasis on vocational training in line with the philosophy of Booker T. Washington. Frazelia Campbell moved on to Allen University in South Carolina, where she gained fame as a classicist. In 1885, when Campbell was principal of the female department of the Institute, the Christian Recorder, house organ of the AME Church, published an article titled "A German Paper on the Review." The Review was a cultural magazine published by the church, and the third edition carried Campbell's article, Die beiden Piccolomini, an analysis of the second drama in Schiller's Wallenstein trilogy. The Recorder mentioned this notable quote from her analysis, and I quote, "As long as the German language exists, as long as a love for all that is truly great and noble and beautiful finds a place in the hearts of men, so long will the name of Friedrich Schiller be held in grateful and revered remembrance." Not just merely a Schiller fan, Campbell probably approached the author through the perspective of her classical training. In another essay, Tacitus' German Women, she criticized the then prevalent romantic notion that women were held in high regard in Germany and stated, quote, "At no time has the German woman, either in the age of Tacitus or of Bismarck, been recognized as a responsible being. Among all the tribes, the women are considered irresponsible as to thought and action," end of quote. A feminist note resonates in these comments of a classicist and Germanist. Frazelia Campbell was not just interested in high culture. The January 17th, 1878 edition of the Christian Recorder carried her translation of a review published in the Vossische Zeitung of the performance of the Jubilee Singers in Berlin. Theodor Fontana was the editor at that time, but there's no indication in Campbell's translation that he was the writer of a rather laudatory review of the group's performance. Fisk University opened in 1866 as an institution of higher learning that was not segregated. Funding a new university was a major undertaking, and therefore, beginning on October 6, 1871, a group of young men and women began traveling first in America and then after 1873 in Europe, singing Negro spirituals in an effort to raise funds for the new university. The Berlin concert was part of a tour that began in 1874 and raised about $150,000 for Fisk. Members of the group complained about ill treatment on the tours, and it's especially noteworthy that the German critic concludes his remarks by stating, and I quote, "The whole evening was one of suggestiveness and keen enjoyment for us, and we would wish that the German people would give to their Black brothers the support which they so richly deserve," end of quote. A powerful statement for the African-American leadership of the Recorder in 1878, 1 year after the federal government had abandoned its effort to protect Black rights in the South and paved the way for Jim Crow. It is at Fisk University that we connect to our final Black intellectual in the 19th century. W.E.B. Du Bois, who lived from 1868 to 1963, entered Fisk University in 1885 as a sophomore because of his excellence of his education in Massachusetts. He was from Great Barrington. One of the subjects he studied at Fisk was German, and German culture proved to be an important catalyst for his intellectual development. As valedictorian of his class in 1888, Du Bois spoke on Otto von Bismarck and emphasized that he represented the power of purpose, the force of an idea. In that same year, Du Bois composed a lengthy essay in German titled Das neue Vaterland, clearly directed at the flood of recent German emigres, in which he echoes Douglass' belief from the 1850s that Germans were not racist at heart and would not align themselves with American racism. The essay was apparently never published and is on deposit at the DuBois archives at Amherst College. Kenneth Barkin's fascinating article, Germany on His Mind, Das Neue Vaterland, published in 2006 in the Journal of African American History, speculates on the pre-knowledge DuBois had of German culture before he attended Harvard and then the Berlin University. Barkin notes that DuBois had 3 years of German at Fisk and was likely aware of the philosophies of Hegel and Schopenhauer, as well as moments in German history such as the defeat of Prussia in 1806 and the defeat of France at Sedan. It has often been stated that DuBois' admiration of contemporary German extended to his physical exterior. He reportedly decided to cultivate the same sort of facial hair as Kaiser Wilhelm II. More important is his decision to study in Germany. DuBois' professional aspirations were the main cause for his visit. In his time, the majority of university professors were either German or had studied in Germany. The desire to work to promote his race informed all of DuBois' academic decisions. History and sociology were his field of study, and his 1899 study, The Philadelphia Negro, is one of the earliest sociological studies. Another example of his relationship to Germany was Souls of Black Folk, which appeared in 1903. Each chapter begins with a quote from a poet, as well as a musical score of a Negro spiritual. Schiller is quoted in one chapter, but in the chapter titled Of the Coming of John, DuBois interspersed a realistic description of race relations in the South with allusions to Lohengrin. Russell Berman has provided an interesting analysis of this chapter in which DuBois compares the failure of Reconstruction's attempt to create a new society with Lohengrin's failure. In the 20th century, there have been numerous examples of African Americans exploring and adapting German culture to their own personal, political, or personal agendas. Alain Leroy Locke, the chief promoter of the Harlem Renaissance, was deeply influenced by his time of study, both at Harvard, where he earned both the bachelor and the Ph.D., but also the University of Berlin, where, among others, Georg Simmel influenced Locke's program of using art to exert influence over the masses. Although it has not been investigated, Locke's seminal publication on the Harlem Renaissance, The New Negro, undoubtedly owes some debt to the ideas of Nietzsche, especially the concept of der neue Mensch. Two of the creative artists, whom Locke brought together were the German painter Winold Reiss, who painted important contributors to the Renaissance, along with Locke and Aaron Douglass. Douglass's paintings evoke memories of the Blaue Reiter and German Expressionism. Also in the 1920s, Georgiana Simpson became the first African-American woman to earn the doctorate in German. Her thesis topic is characteristic, Herder's concept of das Volk. Herder's core concepts of Volk and Humanität were clearly attractive to African-American intellectuals such as DuBois and Locke, who saw art and artistic performance as a means to elevate and ennoble their race. Simpson came to German through her years working with German emigres in Washington, D.C. She began her formal education in the language at the University of Chicago, where she encountered the same racism that was endemic in American education and society. Denied adequate on-campus housing, she was forced to live off campus. In 2017, two female students at the University of Chicago organized the Monument Women Project and commissioned a bust of Simpson to be placed at the university's Simpson Club. It was placed directly across from the relief that honors President Judson, the official who banned her from campus because of her race. While this recognition came decades after her death, during her lifetime, Simpson could find employment only at Howard University, the premier Black university of the day. None of the white institutions were interested in her. A similar fate befell Ernst Just, pardon my German, who lived from 1883 to 1941. He was one of the leading biologists of the early 20th century. Denied a position at a leading research university, he spent his teaching career at Howard. In 1912, excuse me, he married Ethel Highwarden, a fellow Howard colleague who taught German. Between 1929 and 1938, Just made 10 or more visits to Europe. In 1930, he was the first American invited to do research at the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft zur Förderung der Wissenschaften in Berlin. He divorced his wife in 1939 and married Hedwig Schnetzler, a philosophy student whom he had met in Berlin, who incidentally was Jewish. Failing to find a nurturing academic environment in America, Just settled with his German wife in France, but the German invasion resulted in his internment. Luckily, his release was soon arranged, and he returned to America, where he died in 1941 from pancreatic cancer. Percy Levon Julian, 1899 to 1975, an American research chemist and pioneer in the chemical synthesis of medicinal drugs from plants, shared a similar fate to Just because of his race. Rejected at Harvard in 1923, he enrolled at the University of Vienna, where he earned the doctorate in chemistry in 1931. Denied a position at his alma mater, DePaul University, because of his race, Julian taught for a time at Howard University until he was caught up in university politics and forced to resign. After 1936, he worked for Glidden, and his work not only garnered him more than 130 patents, but also laid the foundation for the steroid industry's production of cortisone and other corticosteroids, and birth control pills. He was likely hired for the position of research director at Glidden's soya production division in Chicago because he was fluent in German. An example of Julian's proficiency of German was demonstrated in a November 1933 article published in the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis. Titled "The New Interests of Austrian Youth in Negro Prose and Poetry," Julian reviewed Anna Nussbaum's 1929 anthology of African-American poetry titled Afrika singt. Nussbaum translated leading new Negro poets such as Langston Hughes, Jean Toomer, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Georgia Douglas Johnson, and Gwendolyn Bennett, along with the older generations such as James Weldon Johnson and W.E.B. DuBois. In his review of the anthology, Julian lauded the translator as well as Dr. Anton Willigans, director of Vienna's Burgtheater, whose Literarische Monatshefte had published translations of works by Hughes and James Weldon Johnson. Willigans had also encouraged Austrian students to study recent African-American poetry, and one of them, Otto Brandt, was the translator of the poems in the Monatshefte and also author of a feuilleton titled Die Geschichte einer Hinrichtung, the description of an unjust execution in Tennessee. Clearly, Julian hoped that African-American and Austrian youth could find a common ground to share thoughts and aspirations. The process begun by James W.C. Pennington continues well into the 21st century, both on an academic and non-academic level. Social activist and philosopher Angela Davis was a student of Herbert Marcuse at Brandeis and in California. At his insistence, she studied in Frankfurt under his former colleague Adorno. At a recent reading in our area, when prompted to identify German thinkers who had influenced her thinking on society and the individual, Professor Davis also mentioned Jürgen Habermas. Certainly a topic worthy of research and discussion. Germany has also been attractive to the non-academic. For example, in the arts, excuse me, I have a little bit, my allergies are catching up to me. For example, in the arts, Ira Aldrich, the first great African-American tragedian, toured the German states and Russia, performing Shakespeare's Othello, as well as plantation songs. This is before the Civil War. Besides the Fisk Jubilee singers, a number of other individual and group performers entertain German audiences. Rainer E. Lutz presents an encyclopedic review of those performers in his book, Black People, Entertainers of African Descent in Europe and Germany, 1997. Three performers who must be mentioned in closing are Roland Hayes, Paul Robeson, Louis Douglas, and Marian Anderson. Of these three, Douglas is probably the least recognizable today. Born in Philadelphia in 1889, Douglas toured Ireland in a children's review in 1903 and then spent 1903 to 1908 on tour with Belle Davis. He appeared with her in the 1906 film, Die schöne Davis mit ihren drei Negern. He then became a solo dancer and choreographer and starred in La Revue Nègre with Josephine Baker in Paris in 1925. When the review moved to Berlin, Baker was called back to Paris, where she spent the rest of her life. Douglas and his wife, Marion Cook, not only starred in the review, but also appeared on German radio to introduce the newest dance craze, the Charleston. Douglas played in two major films, Einbrecher and Niemandsland. The latter was an anti-war film banned by the Nazis and then re-released in New York as Hell on Earth. In this film, Douglas continued a tradition that extended back several decades as a Black performer in German films. Louis Brody was an Afro-German expatriate from Cameroon, whose German film career extended from before World War I until his death in 1952. Both of Douglas's films were talkies, and in Niemandsland, due to his extensive touring experience, he was able to speak German, French, and Russian. The above had just skimmed the surface of German African-American interaction, a topic to be explored and which is apparently relatively unknown today, is the approximately 4 decades after 1870, when German Freemasons recognized Prince Hall Freemasons as a brother organization. As a consequence, Black and German Freemasons visited each other's lodges. Freemasonry, because of its emphasis on tolerance and the brotherhood of man, not only fulfilled the need of people denied their essential humanity by their own country, the need for such recognition attracted African Americans to the Germany of poets and thinkers in which such basic humanity was firmly rooted. Thank you. That was about 40 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much,
Oh, sure. Glad to.
Dr. Hopkins, for this exciting time travel, I guess, from the 18th century to nowadays. And that clearly shows the correlation between academic work and social activism, and to force us to recreate histories or hidden stories, so to speak, that are not maybe so much hidden.
Well, the newspapers are a good way to approach it. I was fortunate. I used newspapers.com, and then also through the university, I have access to accessible archives, and all the antebellum Black newspapers are on. It's a searchable database, so I got a chance to use my computer a lot. It's one of the joys of being retired.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I know you and me, we definitely have to stay in contact and talk about that, because I also have found on my research in German American newspapers different representations about race, about Blacks, about Black intellectuals, and different concepts, and sometimes, and that's why I want to raise my first question, definitely, is you touched upon the subject, how different generations in the 19th century what their attitudes were towards Blacks or the question of slavery in general. So I would ask you, could you please elaborate on this further?
Well, the 48ers were like Carl Schurz, who came to the States and was a 48er. And he served in the Civil War. He was abolitionist. And as a matter of fact, he was a member of one of the lodges that still exists in Philadelphia or in Warminster, the Lodge 120, Hermann and Humboldt Lodge. The 48ers, they fought against slavery, a form of slavery in Europe. So when they came to this country, it was natural that they would latch onto the anti-slavery cause. As among the conservative Germans, and I'm going to talk briefly about that in my next lecture. Here in Lancaster County, we have Amish, Mennonite, we have other groups, the so-called church Germans, and then the plain Germans. And if you look at their ideology, slavery was something of the world, and they believed the world was created by God. So therefore, slavery was not evil. It was just a trial that people had to go through, and that someone like Muhlenberg, Heinrich Melchior Muhlenberg, who was the father of the Lutheran Church in America. I did a paper on him. I read through his journal. He was not upset by slavery. What upset him was that the slave masters in the South refused to educate their slaves. And he thought that they had to be literate to read the Bible, and that way they would secure their freedom in the next world, which of course was no consolation to the enslaved. Zinzendorf, who was the leader of the Moravians, he was challenged on what he was doing. He was proselytizing Native Americans and Africans, and he was accused of making them, fomenting rebellion. And he said, no, the purpose of our work is to make them better servants. So that's the dichotomy. There were very few who were interested in freeing or ending slavery. Those few that were 48ers. The other German groups did not see that as a necessary goal. What you have to remember, just looking at Pennsylvania, slavery existed in Pennsylvania legally up till 1780. In March of 1780, the Gradual Abolition Act was passed. And what this law said, that children born to slaves after March 1st, 1780 would be liable for service until they were 28 years of age. Those who were slaves before that would be slaves for life. So the German counties, such as Lancaster, voted against it because they didn't want to free the slaves. And of course, the law was very beneficial to the slaveholders because not only were the children made indentured servants, but also the grandchildren. So that by 1830, the state Supreme Court had to intervene and said it was never the intent of the original law to create a class of servants in perpetuity. So the attitude it varies. It's just like today. I have met many Afro-Germans, and of course what they prefer is Afro-Deutsche, and the word Neger to them is as bad as the N-word is to us here. Mischling is another one they don't like.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I was, before I joined the GHI in Washington, I was also teaching at the University of Stuttgart, works such as Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. And then, of course, we have to talk about the word. We have to talk
Okay.
about the representation, but my students, they felt so uncomfortable. And when I asked the question, would you feel comfortable, because some of them would become teachers in the future, right? So would you feel comfortable teaching to 13-year-old kids the novel? And everybody, it was very uncertain conceptions about that. Some people, good arguments for it, but also, of course, against. And I think this is why works such as Huckleberry Finn is one of the most, discussed work nowadays, because we don't have one answer. There's so many different interpretations.
Oh, one of the things is the buzzword today is critical race theory.
Yeah.
And it probably was influential in the election in Virginia because McAuliffe was depicted as saying that parents should not decide what their students learn in school. And that was misconstrued to say that the school board should do this. And in our area, for example, there was a strike a month or so ago. One of the school boards banned all literature dealing with African Americans because what it did was it developed a negative picture of this country. And the students themselves went on strike, and they reinstated it. They politicized the question. I was asked recently at a lecture when I thought of critical race theory, and I said, it's American history without blinders. If you study our history, there are good patches and there are bad patches, but the good, I think, outweighs the bad. If we, because you look at what has happened with African Americans over the 400 years that we've been here, despite being enslaved, brutalized, lynched, every war that America was involved in, African Americans were heroes. Now, why would they do that? Were they I don't know, was that a masochism, or it's because they believe in the basic tenets of this country? A historian once told me that America would not be America without African Americans, because at every point in our history, when we seem to forget what our country is about, African Americans have stepped up and said, no, this is what it has to be. If it weren't for the African American civil rights movement, there wouldn't have been a women's movement. You have to remember, Frederick Douglass was one of the ones who spoke out for women's rights. He was in Saratoga with the women. The women who in the movement, they thought that they should get the vote first and blacks would second. And prior to the reenactment of or the ratification of the 19th Amendment, when they marched in Washington, they told the black women to march in the back because they didn't want to upset their Southern supporters. So race has always been a divisive issue in our society. It's become a divisive issue in Germany also.
And not talking about it is another form of silencing, right?
Oh, sure.
So we have two questions in our chat. I'll start with the first one by Hazel. Hazel writes, I'm a professor of psychology at Germanic University and appreciate Dr. Hopkins' mention of our school in his talk. My question is whether Germans were prejudiced against blacks prior and after World War II, or if prejudiced American whites strongly influenced Germans to be prejudiced by threatening to boycott any German businesses who served blacks.
That's an interesting question. It's probably yes to both questions. Excuse me. For example, in our area, we had prior to 1850, a large number of Germans populated our area. In my hometown of Lancaster, up until about 1820, German was the language you would hear on the streets. And Columbia, which is a little town on the Susquehanna, was heavily populated by Germans. And there were race riots there in 1834 and 1835. And the reason for the race riots was competition. And you had a group of people, we call them colonizationists, who thought that the best way to solve the race problem was to send all people of color back to Africa. And they fomented these problems. Now, in terms of the rest of your question, in Germany, you're not prejudiced against someone you don't see. The African presence in Germany begins in the 15th century, but there is more of an exotic object, the so-called court Moors, Hofmohren. In the various courts, they collected exotic plants, exotic animals, and exotic people. And as I mentioned with Amo, the idea was, is he really human? If he can be Europeanized, be educated, then maybe they're human. Peter the Great did the same thing with Ibrahim Hannibal. And Hannibal and Amo knew each other, they corresponded. But to look at the roots of racism, you have to look at the beginning of Germany's colonial period. After the Berlin Conference, you had Belgium, France, England. Americans were there as observers, and Africa was divided between them. Germany, of course, got Togo, Cameroon, or portions of Cameroon called Douala, and what is now Namibia, and then portions of Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda. And in Hamburg, there's the Colonial Institute, which was set up at the end of the 19th century. And it's interesting that the Beirat that ran it was headed by a Jew. And it was an economic thing. Warburg was the sort of chair of the Wirtschaftlicher Beirat. And the contact then lets these feelings come to the fore. And of course, it exists in folklore or in children's rhyme. Zehn kleine Negerlein, for example. Wilhelm Busch talks about it. Also, Hoffmann talks about it in his book, Struwwelpeter. There's a reference to the blackness. And of course, what happens is it's sublimated. There were no, even the Nazis, during the Nazi period, the official policy was hands off on Africans, because what was hoped was that access would be gained to the rich resources in Africa. There's a book called Was wollte Hitler denn in Afrika? Now this means that there were not individuals who ended up in camps. For example, I don't know if you know the book Farbe bekennen, Afrodeutsche Frauen auf den Spuren ihrer Geschichte, came out in 1985 and was translated in 1992 as Showing Our Colors, Afro-German Women Speak Out. And the first, it's oral histories and documentary histories. Well, the oral history, the first group is, the title is Unser Vater kam aus Kamerun, unsere Mutter aus Ostpreußen. And it's the story of two sisters. The one sister marries this Louis Brody that I mentioned. And their father got into problems because he had a business and he was Black. And one of the family ended up in the camp, but they were able to get him out of the camp. And of course, during the Nazi period, there was about 150 Africans who were stranded. Actually, after World War I, they were stranded in Germany because they couldn't go back. If they went back to Cameroon, they'd be interned as enemy aliens. The British would not accept them. The French wouldn't accept them. And so there's a whole group. One of the books I have on my shelf is Herr Michael. I don't know if you know him. I'll find it. It's called Black German, Theodor Michael, and he just passed away 2 years ago. Beautiful voice. He was from Berlin, acted on the stage, and there's also a film called In der Traumfabrik, Pagen in der Traumfabrik, and it's about what happened to the Africans stranded in Germany during that period. Some of them ended up in the so-called Völkerschauen. Hamburg was one. What's the name of the big zoo in Hamburg? Well, that's not important, but anyway, the Völkerschau. The idea was started by Buffalo Bill.
Hagenbeck, yeah.
Hagenbeck, yeah, Hagenbeck. And when they were stopped, then they were in the so-called colonial film. And Brody was in many of those films. He usually played a chieftain or had some minor role in it.
Thank you. I guess this already wrapped up or touched upon the other two questions that were asked about Germany's colonial history.
That's an interesting question, and actually, you probably could write a book about it.
Yeah, definitely, because I mean, we see this in Germany as well, that there's so much that has to be written about on German's colonial history.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Well, one of the issues that came up a couple of years ago was there was a play performed in which Germans performed in blackface, and some of the Afro-Germans were upset about that.
Yeah. And this goes to another question by Naomi. I wonder, where does the idea or conception of Germany as a bastion of humanness and liberty come from for African American scholars, especially in the 20th century, given the context of European/German colonialism and rising anti-Semitism?
Well, it comes from the literature and philosophy. You have to remember, excuse me, in the 19th century, German thought really was at the heart of American education. One of the early universities, University of Virginia, started by Thomas Jefferson, German was at the core of the university. And anyone, like I said, DuBois knew about Schopenhauer, he knew about Hegel, although Hegel's not a good example since he considered Africa as a country without culture or without history. But I would say through especially through the literature, Goethe was very well known. Schiller, if you read them, you can't but have a positive image of Germany. And I think that's what the case was. DuBois lived in Germany for those years. Matter of fact, he probably could have married a German woman, but he decided no, he had to go back and devote his life to his cause. There was, despite the overt racism, he took lectures with, I can't think of the name of the professor, but the professor talked about how mulattoes were an abomination. And DuBois, his name is William Edward Burckhardt DuBois, he was part Dutch. And so he was a mulatto. And he just ignored that because he was interested more in the basic idea of one individual or a idea changing the country.
And just two more questions, so to speak,
Sure.
for tonight's event. First, Morgan is asking, how have the children of Black American soldiers and recent immigrants changed the modern Afro-Deutsche culture?
See, there's the issue. It's been a sort of a bone of contention. No one knows how many children there are. But it's been estimated there are about 500,000 Germans of African or African-American descent. And the movement started in the 1980s, the Afro-Deutsche. It was, I'm drawing a blank on her name, from Hunter College. She spoke in Berlin, gave a lecture and a seminar on Black literature and African-American women's literature. And as a result, in the audience, there were these biracial women. And the movement in Germany was carried mainly by women. They had publications. The first publication was called, well, they changed the name after about a year because of the title. It was called Uncle Tom's Faust. And they figured that was a little too in your face. So they changed it to, what was it? Afro Look. And then there was another publication, Strangers. The person who started that, Michael Kripos, has his program is called Afro Take, and it's a multimedia conglomerate, and they have programs. The Afro-Germans have, it's the ISD, Initiative Schwarzer Deutsche, and they have, for example, in Berlin, there's a Black History Month, and it's better than ours because they have theirs in May. We have ours in February, the coldest and the shortest month. And as I said, I've met some of them. I've met at least two of the women from Farbe Bekennen. One, Helge Emde, I brought to Millersville's campus. And the other I met at the apartment of a woman who wrote her dissertation on the image of Africans in the German illustrated magazines after World War II. And so they've done some things. What I find fascinating is how they perceive American culture, African-American culture. In many cases, they don't understand that we're not rich just because we're Americans. And so they expect us to support some of their things. But in many cases, we think alike. It's not accidental that in their magazines, this is going back 20 some years, that you'll see advertisements about Nina Simone conferences, concerts, James Brown. Of course, I'm also interested in rap music. And the first Afro-German rap group was Advanced Chemistry. And if you go on YouTube, you can see Fremd im eigenen Land. And they discuss this whole idea of what DuBois called double consciousness. The double conscience is being African and American, well, being African and German. They try to discuss that in the song. And since then, Brothers and Sisters was the follow-up group to that. And they were doing anti-racism work in throughout Germany, going to the schools. But that's been several years ago, before the pandemic.
Before the corona will.
Yeah.
So for our last question, we focus again on rather German-American relationships and the African-American experience. And the question is by David. Didn't the German Hessians fight alongside indigenous as well as African Americans during the American Revolution? In the time since John Lederer's discoveries, there seemed to be a very quiet relationship between indigenous American life and pagan German culture. Is it possible that the African American intellectual relationship with Germans is deeply rooted in cultural similarities?
I don't know about similarities, but attractiveness. When you have it's just like why did Africans become Methodists? The Methodist Church, unlike the other churches, talked about the basic humanity of man, the brotherhood of man, And that's what I myself and AME, that's African Methodist Episcopal. And our church began in Philadelphia in 1787. But no, I don't think you can say that. Well, the German. What's interesting, talking about the Hessians. Of course, they weren't all from Hesse, and they certainly weren't mercenaries. They were forced. Lessing talks about that in his drama. But I bought a copy of Hetrina. Hetrina is the Hessische Truppen in America, and it's published by the archives in Oberhessisches Archiv, and Inge Auerbach is one of the editors, and it lists who went back with the troops, and so you'll see a name, and then after it in parentheses in N, Neger. That tells you that's an African, and one of the Africans who went back with the Hessian troops was, I think, from Virginia. And what caught my eye was his name. His name was Goethe. And I thought, because you look at pictures of the young Goethe, he has certain African characteristics, but I don't think it's the same person. Well, I know it's not the same person, because this is 1780s. By that time, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe he was just Johann Wolfgang Goethe. He was well established by that time in Weimar.
Oh, yeah.
And
Fantastic.
thank you. And if I may, I want to ask one final question, but I could
Go
also,
ahead.
before I hand over to Bettina, but I could also ask that question to Frank Trommler as well. It's about, where do you see the future of German culture, German literature in the American academic system?
Oh, well, let me tell you something about my institution. I started Millersville in 1979 on the faculty. There were 5 of us teaching German then. It's now just one person. And I think the problem is the curriculum. We have not, or my colleagues were not able to bring these new ideas in. That's one of the reasons that I was interested in the Afro-Germans, because this is something that I think would be attractive to African-American students, because students of color and women are the untapped resources for college, university, and universities. They're not coming to college, and then my own system, we're in a deep crisis now because of declining enrollments. So what is the answer? Declining enrollments? You raise the tuition. And of course, by raising the tuition, you block those students who might profit from an education. But I think German culture, German literature can still be taught at the university level. One of the things that's not been solved, especially in Pennsylvania, is that percentage-wise, we have more students taking German in high school here in the Commonwealth, and the smallest number going from the high school to the college. So something has to be done at the school level to make it more appropriate or make it more attractive. And I tell anyone, I talked recently to a community college group about Germany, and I told them, usually Americans will take French, German, or Spanish. And I said, French and Spanish, they have no money. There are no scholarships for future study. Germany does have money. Germany does invest in the study program. AATG, the Goethe Institute, those are all, the French have that, but they want you to give them money, not the other way around.
Okay, I'm just going to unfortunately have to intervene because I think our time is almost up. But I want to thank Dr. Hopkins so much for that fantastic talk. It was really exciting, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing part 2, which will be on November 17th at 6 o'clock. I think Alex put the links in the chat, but I want to just invite everybody to, if you didn't get to do it during the talk, feel free to go to the German Society's website and you can sign up there. Also, just wanted to mention again, put a plug in for the next treasure tour, which is going to take place on November 20th at 2 o'clock. The title is Early Pennsylvania from a German Vantage Point, Francis Daniel Pastorius's Poetic Encounters with His New Environment. And this will be a small hands-on tour, limited to 15 people. And so if you're interested in that, please sign up at the on the website as well. And I want to thank Dr. Hopkins again, and thank you all for coming tonight. And have a good evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, and see you all soon.
Yep.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your talk, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Bettina.
Bye-bye. Thank you for recording. You can pause now. Thanks.